d4, knight f6, c4, g6, f3, c5, d5, d6, e4, bishop g7, knight e2, e6, bishop g5, short castle, knight e c3, h6, bishop e3, e takes d5, c takes d5, knight h7, bishop e2, a6, a4, f5, short castle, f4, bishop d2, b6, knight a3, knight d7, king h1, knight e5, rook b1, g5, b4, knight f6, b takes c5, b takes c5, a5, queen takes a5, knight a4, queen d8, knight b6, rook b8, knight b c4, rook takes b1, queen takes b1, knight h5, bishop e1, knight f7, knight b6, knight f6, knight a c4, bishop d7, knight takes d7, knight takes d7, bishop a5, queen c8, queen b3, knight d e5, knight d2, queen d7, rook b1, h5, queen d1, rook c8, rook c1, rook b8, rook c3, queen c8, rook c1, rook b2, bishop c3, rook b6, knight b3, knight g6, bishop a5, rook b8, rook b1, knight f e5, knight d2, rook takes b1, queen takes b1, knight f7, knight c4, knight g e5, queen b6, knight takes c4, bishop takes c4, queen e8, queen b3, queen e5, queen b8, check, king h7, queen b1, queen d4, bishop takes a6, knight e5, bishop c7, c4, Bishop takes d6, knight d3, h3, g4, e5, king h6, bishop e7, knight f2, check, king g1, c3, bishop a3, c2, queen takes c2, knight takes h3, check, king f1, queen g1, check, king e2, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, f3, c5, d5, d6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, short castle, bishop d3, knight b d7, f4, e6, d takes e6, f takes e6, knight f3, knight b8, short castle, knight c6, bishop e3, b6, queen e1, bishop a6, rook d1, knight b4, b3, knight g4, bishop b1, knight takes e3, queen takes e3, queen f6, knight e2, queen e7, e5, d takes e5, knight takes e5, rook a d8, rook takes d8, rook takes d8, bishop e4, bishop b7, a3, bishop takes e5, f takes e5, knight c6, knight c3, knight d4, bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, knight e4, queen e7, knight f6, check, king g7, queen g5, rook f8, h4, king h8, b4, queen c7, rook d1, rook d8, queen h6, a5, b5, queen g7, queen e3, a4, rook d3, h6, king h1, rook f8, rook d2, knight f5, queen f4, knight d4, king g1, rook c8, queen e4, Rook f8. Rook f2. Rook c8. King h2. Knight f5. Rook d2. Knight d4. Queen e3. Rook d8. Rook d1. Rook b8. Rook f1. Knight f5. Queen e4. Rook c8. Rook f2. Rook f8. g4. Knight d4. Queen e3. Knight b3. King g2. Knight d4. King g1. Rook d8. Knight e4. King g8. Rook f6. Knight c2. Queen c1. Knight d4. King f2. Rook f8. Queen f4. Knight b3. h5. G takes h5. Rook takes f8. Check. Queen takes f8. Knight f6. Check. King h8. G takes h5. Queen g7. d4. Knight f6. c4. g6. Knight c3. d5. Bishop d2. Bishop g7. C takes d5. Knight takes d5. e4. Knight b6. Bishop e3. Short castle. Bishop b5. Bishop e6. Knight f3. Knight c4. Bishop takes c4. Bishop takes c4. Queen a4. Bishop a6. h4. h5. b4. c6. Queen b3. Knight d7. a4. b6. Rook d1. e6. b5. C takes b5. A takes b5. Bishop b7. Short castle. Rook c8. e5. Bishop takes f3. G takes f3. Queen takes h4. King g2. Queen e7. Knight e4. Rook c7. Bishop g5. f6. E takes f6. Knight takes f6. Rook f e1. King h8. Knight takes f6. Bishop takes f6. Rook takes e6. Queen d8, Bishop f4, Rook d7, d5, King h7, d6, Bishop g5, Bishop g3, Rook f5, Rook d5, Rook d f7, Rook takes f5, Rook takes f5, Bishop e5, Queen c8, Queen d5, h4, d7, h3, check. King takes h3, Queen c1, King g2, Bishop d8, Rook takes g6, Rook g5, check. d4, Knight f6, c4, g6, Knight f3, Bishop g7, e3, c5, d5, short castle, Bishop e2, e6, Knight c3, e takes d5, c takes d5, d6, Knight d2, Rook e8, short castle, b6, a4, Knight a6, a5, Bishop b7, e4, Knight c7, Bishop d3, Rook b8, a takes b6, a takes b6, Rook a7, Bishop c8, Queen a4, Bishop d7, Queen a2, Rook e7, Knight f3, Bishop g4, Bishop g5, h6, Bishop e3, b5, Queen a5, Rook d7, Knight e2, Queen c8, Knight g3, Bishop takes f3, g takes f3, h5, Rook a1, h4, Knight f1, Knight h5, Rook a2, Queen d8, King h1, Bishop e5, Queen d2, Queen f6, Bishop e2, Knight f4, Bishop takes f4, Bishop takes f4, Knight e3, Rook e7, h3, Knight e8, Rook 7 a6, Bishop takes e3, f takes e3, Knight g7, Bishop d1, knight h5, b4, c takes b4, queen d4, queen takes d4, e takes d4, rook c7, rook c6, rook d7, bishop e2, b3, rook b2, rook a7, king g1, rook a2, rook takes a2, b takes a2, rook a6, knight f4, bishop f1, b4, rook takes a2, b3, rook b2, king g7, e5, king f8, e takes d6, king e8, king f2, king d7, king e3, g5, bishop c4, rook b4, bishop takes b3, king takes d6, rook b1, knight takes h3, bishop a2, rook takes b1, bishop takes b1, knight f4, king f2, knight takes d5, bishop a2, f6, bishop b1, knight f4, bishop e4, king c7, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, knight c3, d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, knight takes c3, b takes c3, c5, bishop e3, bishop g4, rook c1, bishop takes f3, g takes f3, queen a5, queen b3, short castle, d5, knight d7, h4, h5, bishop e2, rook f d8, rook g1, king f8, king f1, queen c7, c4, knight f6, queen b1, queen h2, f4, b6, e5, queen h3, check, king e1, knight e8, bishop d3, b5, rook g3, queen takes h4, bishop takes g6, B takes c4. Bishop takes f7. King takes f7. Queen f5. Check. King g8. King e2. Rook d6. E takes d6. Queen f6.